At the time that Osmod the Great was leading his conquest, there was a province within the lands once known as Tigeria called Edenvale. Edenvale was a nation primarily made up of humans, but with a rather sizable population of non-human races, including elves, dwarves, merfolk, centaurs, and others. The land was controlled by a local lord named Lord Isaiah Corvintus. Isaiah had 3 children, 2 sons and a daughter. The eldest son, Maximilian, was a brash young man who acted without thinking and caused more problems than he solved. The daughter, Angelina, was conceited and spoiled. As the youngest, she was often given what she asked for and was very used to having things her way. But the second son, whose true name has long been forgotten to time, was a level-headed child and respectful. However, he was also a sickly boy. From the time he was born, he was afflicted with fevers, illness, and was often in bed. When he could walk, he strolled the city streets, marveling at the non-human races. As he spent most of his time in the castle, he was always so surrounded by humans he rarely got to see non-humans. He wished to make friends amongst their kind, though was often warned against it by his family. But when the boy turned 14, he witnessed something strange. An envoy of men dressed in Osmodian clothing were hauling a mermaid from the water in chains. They were collecting slaves for the Osmod slave trade. The boy didn't know what was happening, but he couldn't ignore it. He ran to fight them, but his sickly and weak frame was no match for the slavers, who overpowered him easily. Though he was no threat, opposing Osmod's will was a heinous crime, and risked the wrath of the Empire. To save face, Lord Isaiah Corvintus was required to either turn over his son or kill him. Unable to do either, Corvintus exiled his son to the wilds, where he would undoubtedly die on his own. The boy wandered into the Badlands, a land of bandits, outlaws, monsters, and dark races that had turned their backs on Alanai in favor of darker powers. The boy was certain to die. Desperate and starving, the child collapsed in the wilderness, prepared for death. But Alanai saw him and had greater plans. He called upon one of his faithful Dayanan, Solon. Solon found the boy and told him to get up and live. The boy replied that he couldn't. He had nothing, and he would die. But then Solon pointed to a nearby landslide where a boar was stuck as ravens flew around him, harassing it and injuring it, weakening the beast. And Solon told him, "Even the ravens are provided for." Seeing this blessing, the boy killed the boar and ate its meat. Solon then renamed him Raven and healed him, restoring his health, granting him strength, resilience, and endurance, removing his sickly nature. Indebted to Solon and Alanai, Raven asked what was expected of him. Solon then took the boy under his wing and promised to train him to fulfill his purpose for Alanai. Raven was trained in survival skills, how to live off the land, and more than this, he was trained in how to fight with various weapons and tools. Solon was a fierce and strict teacher, educating the boy in the ways of combat, tactics, and strategy, how to hunt and how to flee, how to wait for the proper moments to act, and how to disengage when necessary. Raven struggled and endured, fighting through every test and trial with as much conviction as he could offer. After he'd shown proficiency in combat, Solon then educated Raven on the ways of the Ethereum and sorcery. When Raven had trained with Solon for 10 years, he was finally granted the ultimate gift, the Yatagoras Eye planted on his forehead. This eye allowed Raven to peer into the Ethereum and increased his sorcery abilities 100-fold. But merely having this power was not enough. Solon informed him that his quest would require more than a blessed eye. Rather, it would require him to reclaim his homeland, his birthright, and begin rebuilding the great Tigerian Empire and bringing Andarism back to the world. Raven wasn't sure how to begin achieving this, but he assumed his best course was to first return home and reclaim Edenvale. But upon his return, Raven discovered things had changed drastically. It appeared that sometime after his exile, the Osmod Sultanate had planted a puppet in power named Lord Baryon Mark. He was a useless man, of high ambition but little skill. Fortunately, that was what Osmod wanted in his vassals. With his powers, Raven might have been able to take back his home, but the Yatagoras Eye was a powerful and costly weapon, a power that could hurt him as much as his enemies if not used properly. It would be unwise to retake his home without allies to aid him. He prayed to Alanai to tell him where to go, who to speak to, and who to reach out to. And he was shown. Raven traveled around the outskirts of his home and found that many humans in scattered villages and towns who were sick of Lord Mark's stupidity and complacency were looking to resist and fight. The Raven recruited them to his cause, demonstrating his power and announcing that Alanai had called him to action. He also appealed to the non-humans who Lord Mark had allowed to be stripped of rights and freely farmed for slave labor by the Osmod slavers. The centaurs of the grasslands were the first to pledge their soldiers to the Raven. Later came the ogres of the Dark Mountain, the elves of the deep woods, the lizard folk and the snakekin of the swamps. Raven was amassing an army. But even with this army, Raven was unsure about their chances. With the exception of a few hundred, many of the men and women who pledged to fight were not trained soldiers or combatants, and turning them into warriors would take a long time. Time he simply didn't have. He needed more, one more alliance that would shift the tide and grant them the advantage. However, leaving the lands of Edenvale meant seeking help from his neighbors, and he knew they would not offer their aid freely. No, if he was to liberate his homeland, it had to be at his own hands and with the blood and sweat of his own kinsmen. But there were no others he could call upon now, so he prayed for a sign. At the age of 29, while sleeping in his tent, Raven was given a dream. In the dream, he saw a vision of a great mountain and a dragon perched upon it, and yet the dragon, of a brilliant white with a long snake-like body and enormous wings, smoke billowing from its mouth, looked strangely wrong to Raven. It stared at Raven a long moment before suddenly roaring to the heavens and slipping from the peaks as if sick and dying. Waking, Raven made an announcement to his army. They were to seek out the dragons of the mountains bordering Edenvale. Surprised by this, his advisors urged him against it. The dragons, though not enemies of mortals, were not keen on aiding in their affairs. At best, he would be turned down outright, and at worst he would be killed by the Dragon Empress, their immortal leader. But Raven was firm. There was no doubt in his mind that there was something wrong with the dragons, and he would discover what it was. But little did Raven know that this encounter with the dragons would not only supply him with a new and powerful alliance, but it would also propel him even further on his path to rebuilding Tigharia. The mountains that bordered Tigharia were once home to the dwarves of Dwaragal. However, after the fall of the Tigerian Empire, many of the dwarves left their mountain homes to plunder the spoils of the villages and cities that were now without government or armies. As punishment, Alanai permitted the dragons to settle in the mountains, forever isolating the dwarves from their ancestral homes. The dragons that ruled in these hills were powerful, ruled by a dragon empress, said to be one of the first dragons created in the Age of Creation. This was all information the Raven had learned during his trip to the mountains, and upon reaching the summit, the Raven suggested that he travel alone from here. Despite the protest of his advisors, he made his way into the mountain where it took no time for him to encounter the dragons. They were hostile at first, threatening him with death if he came any further into their domain. However, Raven asked if something ailed them, and to this the dragons did give an answer. Their empress was dying. A strange disease afflicted her, which they could not understand, for dragons are immune to almost every conventional disease. They had no idea how to treat her, and she had been wasting away for months. Raven asked if he might meet the empress, and he was declined at first, until Raven made an offer. "Allow me to meet your empress, and if I cannot heal her affliction, then you may do with me as you like. But if I can discover her ailment and cure it, then consider an alliance with me and my forces of Edenvale." The dragons were unable to see any reason not to permit this action. If this man wished ill on their empress, it would be easy to destroy him, so they finally permitted him to meet the empress. When he stood before the massive dragon, she was exactly like the dragon in his dream, long white body with massive wings, a great head with sword-like teeth and great horns atop her head. Her eyes were closed and in pain. Her countenance was weary and sick. The dragons all gathered around her, mourning and fearful. Raven was allowed to stand before her and look her over. At first, he saw nothing identifiable, but then he removed the wrapping around his forehead, revealing his Yatagharis eye. The eye opened, showing Raven a dark and horrid sight. A cloud of malice and ethereal energy was latching on to the Dragon Empress, weighing her down and sapping her of her energy and life. This was no natural affliction. It was intentionally caused and rendered to her in the hopes of assassinating her. The Raven reached out with his powers of ethereal sorcery and removed this cloud of anguish from the Empress, causing a ripple in the Ethereum that only Daggeroth, far away in Osmod, could feel. though he was not sure what this ripple meant when he felt it. Shortly after, the Empress rose, her color returning, her strength along with it. The dragons around her all sang and roared their approval and joy at the sight of their Empress restored. The Empress turned her eyes upon the raven, who bowed respectfully. It was then she took a human form to speak with him, approaching and smiling. She thanked him profusely for saving her life, and the raven asked what had caused this affliction. She answered that she was unsure, but said that all she remembered encountering was a strange blonde-haired youth with a frightening eye, not unlike the raven's. This news shocked the raven to his core. Could there be another with his eye, with his powers? But this fear would have to save for later, as there was a far more pressing concern for the raven at this moment. As such, he humbly requested the Empress and her dragons ally with him in retaking Edenvale. The Dragon Empress, taken by the raven's compassion and grateful for his aid, agreed to his request and mustered her forces to retake Edenvale in the name of the Raven. With his new alliance secured, the raven returned to his forces below the mountain and ordered them prepared to attack. The battle was to begin soon. Lord Mark was aware of forces of deserters growing restless beyond the main fortress of Edenvale, but he had done little to prepare for it. He had an advisor and battle general from Osmod who handled all military affairs for him, and that advisor saw no need to muster a large defensive force against ragtag insurgents and rioters. However, on the morning of the battle, both Lord Mark and the Osmod general were shocked to hear the roar of angry dragons on the heavens. Looking out, the sky seemed to fill with beasts, as at least 30 or 40 winged serpents engulfed the fields with fiery breath. And out of this sea of flames charged the armies of the Raven, with the Raven Lord himself in the front, dispersing the fires for his soldiers, using his sorcerous powers. The flames seemed to bow and step aside for the warriors of the Raven, but would lash out and snarl at the forces of the Osmod Sultanate. Spears were plunged into flesh. Hooves of centaurs trampled the bones of unprepared warriors. Many broke and run at the charging and unstoppable force encroaching on the fortress walls. Realizing too late the strength of his enemy, the Osmod general pulled his forces back inside the fortress gate to defend themselves. The Dragon Empress came to Raven to ask if she should destroy the walls for him, but the Raven chose against it. He didn't want his family castle destroyed just yet, for he would make use of it in the coming campaigns. Rather, he asked her to remove the gate for his army to enter. The Dragon Empress destroyed the wooden gate and portcullis with little trouble, and within the hour, the Raven and his warriors had entered, slaughtering and tearing down the defenses of the enemy. The whole battle took less than 3 hours, and casualties were completely one-sided, with the Raven only suffering the loss of around 30 to 40 warriors, while Lord Mark's mercenaries and Osmodian warriors had casualties in the hundreds and thousands. The dragons had been a decisive factor in the war, although the Empress speculated that had the Raven unleashed his full powers with his eye, they might not have even been necessary. But this was a calculated move. If there was indeed a threat out there who possessed similar powers to himself, he could not risk sparking their attention too quickly by unveiling his own powers. He had to wait for the opportune time. Lord Mark was brought before the Raven, bound and forced to kneel before the new master of Edenvale. Lord Mark pleaded for mercy from the Raven, and for him not to turn him over to Osmod, for he would surely be killed or worse. The Raven had him imprisoned in the dungeon of the castle until he could decide what to do with him. In the meanwhile, the Raven went to claim his throne. But he had done far more than retake his birthright. The Dragon Empress met with Raven in private. 2 nights after their victory, she humbly requested they extend their alliance indefinitely. When asked why, it was revealed that the Empress, who would reveal her name to be Phelan, had fallen in love with the Raven, and, not wanting to leave him, elected to stay by his side indefinitely. The Raven, moved by her declaration, asked her hand in marriage, cementing a permanent relationship between the House of the Raven and the Dragon race. This union would carry on for generations in the royal line, marking a new lineage in the annals of Tigarea. The word spread far and wide to the lands of not only Tigarea, but Lothra, Dalaheim, Phrygia, Antonia, Legathoia, and, of course, the Osmod Sultanate. With Osmod the Terrible receiving word that Lord Mark had fallen and a new power had supplanted him, he was less than impressed. Lord Mark was no one, But that said, whoever this Raven Lord was had to be made an example of, lest the authority of Osmond be questioned. His expansion turned northward into the kingdom of Albernia and the League of Lothra. Soon he would be at the doorstep of Tigarea and Edenvale. And with him came Daggeroth, who could not shake a strange feeling that something dangerous had awakened in the north. For indeed, the reign of the Raven Lord had just begun.